Hello and welcome to my presentation of Advanced Scythe strategy. First lesson, bottom row actions and Type 1 and Type 2 gameplay. If you've seen my Type 1, Type 2 gameplay video, I would recommend you don't have to see this, especially if you watch my games regularly. Skip this one. There'll be more stuff for you down the line. This is really just an introduction to Advanced Scythe strategy. For anybody who hasn't seen my content before, let's dive into it. Bottom row actions. So bottom row actions are the 4 actions in the bottom row of all the boards. They are upgrade, deploy, build, and enlist. Each of these has its strengths and its weaknesses. So we're going to be discussing today the strengths and weaknesses of each of them before we talk about when you would get stars for them, other important things that relate to them. We're just going to establish what they're good at, what they're bad at. First, upgrades. Upgrades are really strong early game for cost reduction. If you're going to get an upgrade, starting with the upgrade is just the best way to go in terms of efficiency, because it'll reduce the cost of whatever you need to do more of down the line. The move upgrade is absolutely necessary every single game you play of Scythe. Regardless of whatever else you're doing, you're getting your move upgrade every single time. It's just absolutely essential for everything. Bolster power is often a very strong upgrade, and second cost reduction is often very, very strong for most faction board combinations that can use that second cost reduction. The only one I can think of that doesn't really want the second cost reduction is Militant. However, that's more down the line. I'll discuss that when we talk about the Militant board. So a second cost reduction is pretty strong for most faction combinations, and bolster power often ties to a strong coin action. So an upgrade there is typically very strong. Upgrades also have no positional requirements. You're not required to be anywhere in order to upgrade. The weaknesses of upgrades is 6 upgrade actions to get a whole star is 50% more than the 4 actions it takes for the other bottom row actions, which means it takes just much, much longer to get the upgrade star. And the diminishing returns for further cost reduction, as well as the less beneficial top row bonuses, such as popularity gain and coin gain. Coin gain especially just doesn't do anything for you in a game of Scythe. So extra upgrades just really, really diminish in value. After like the second, it falls off very quickly. Sometimes the third can be good, but then it just goes to shit. Next, we're going to talk about deployment, basically the strongest thing in the game. There is basically no positional requirement. You need to be building a mech where you have a worker. That's not really a requirement. It is technically, but very, very technically. Every faction with speed must get speed as a part of playing the game. Similar to the movement upgrade, you need speed. So you're already required to do that, which ties to the bottom one here, which says that mechs are the cheapest and the fastest star to get for factions because you're already required to get speed or rally with every faction except for Togawa, which means you only need 3 more mechs. Very, very strong. Mechs increase your mobility. Every single faction has mechs that increase mobility in a larger sense. They allow for more board control and territory control, since mechs can't control territory. Mechs enable you to get combat stars, enable more advantageous positions, and get you unique effects. So just deployment does all this, and that's a huge reason why deployment is just the most important thing, and why it determines how strong certain factions are. It's a huge factor in that because of how strong the deploy action is. The weakness is a mech position is a vulnerable location and one that can give opponents stars to end the game faster if you do expose a mech in just controlling a territory, as opposed to what we're about to talk about. That's buildings. Buildings control territories and provide no opportunities for your opponents to attack them for stars, but they also don't contest it at all. But typically, you'd rather lose a building location than lose a mech location. Mechs get kicked back, buildings will still persist if they move off, and mechs have to move back out again. In buildings, if you do the building structure bonus, which is huge, you get an extra 9 gold, which is very, very comparable to enlists at their high end. So basically, buildings come with the most bonus gold of anything. So if you're playing with the engineering board, which has the bolster and buildings tied to 3 gold, you often can do that as a strategy because the 9 extra gold plus the 12 gold from getting your 4 buildings that way, plus the combat power getting you the power star, is often a lot of benefit towards going that way. The weaknesses is buildings have a positional requirement. They have to be on a spot a worker is currently and where there isn't already a building. So that's a lot of restriction. It requires more movement, which just tie into like that engineering type 2 gameplay. We'll talk about what type 2 is later, but type 2 typically means you're going to be moving more. So this isn't as much of a weakness for some setups. But for type 1 setups, it's a huge weakness because you're not actually taking as many movement actions. So we'll talk about that more down the line. This weakness can be strong and it can be weak. Last but not least is enlists. Enlists have no positional requirement. They are an income increase if you just pay attention to what your neighbors are doing and what they're going to be doing. They provide the best way to get combat cards in the entire game. They provide bonuses to popularity and combat power in significant ways, and they provide a decent bonus to coins, not as much as buildings with the full 9, but they provide a guaranteed 2 plus however many bolster coins. Let's say you're going for mechs as well as enlists, which is pretty frequent for type 1 boards. You'll get 2 plus potentially 3 plus potentially whatever deployment your neighbors do. And we already talked about how good deployment is. So this can often get up to bonus 9 coins for going for enlists as well. The weaknesses of enlists is, unlike buildings and mechs, they don't control anything on the board. So, yeah. And they aren't as strong early game as upgrades are, obviously. So now let's talk about what I was alluding to there, type 1 versus type 2. If you've already seen my type 1, type 2 video, skip to the time that I'm going to be posting in this video. It should be scrolling on screen right now. If you haven't, here's what I'm talking about, type 1, type 2. So type 1 is the best faction board combination in the game, and type 2 is everybody else. And when I say the best, I don't necessarily mean the purest best, but the best one to get 6 stars with. So let's talk about what that means. So the best at finishing 6 stars, as I said, and winning the game. That's your type 1 gameplay. Typically, one player will have the clear favorite for that. However, that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes there's going to be multiple ones in the same sort of tier, and they'll both be playing type 1 and seeing who can end the game faster. And that changes the way the game is played, and we'll talk about this in later sessions. If there's one person or multiple people going for type 1 gameplay, that could change how you play. So the 6 stars you'll get when you're playing type 1, 8 workers, everybody will always get a worker star. You can do type 1 games which start with 8 workers very, very quickly. Most will have the option to regardless. But you can also go 5 worker with type 1 because you'll typically be taking more produce actions. So 5 workers comes at a lower price, um, just requiring combat power and not requiring coins and popularity. And then you get 8 workers later with your last produce with 3 workers on a village. So, but you'll be getting that star regardless. You'll be getting 1 to 2 bottom row stars, always mechs, sometimes enlists. You'll be getting 0 to 1 objective stars. We'll talk about objectives in the next one. It's the second lesson. 1 to 2 combat stars, depending on what's going on in the game. You're at least typically going to get 1, especially if you're going for some number of enlists. It's very, very easy to pick up a 5 card and get a combat star. And your 16 power star if you're going for that bolster action with a bottom row tied into it, which is usually what you're doing. Now we're talking about mechs and enlists and why. This is good. We'll be getting into it now. So type 1 gameplay takes more produce actions, so they can often actually do produce plus a bottom row action. And why do you want that to be deploy and enlist? And the reason for that is the best boards, patriotic and mechanical, support this strategy. Deploying and enlisting both do not have positional requirements, which is hugely important for type 1 gameplay. Since you're producing more often, you're taking less movement actions, which means you really want to not have any positional requirements. In addition, deploying and enlisting have good synergy together, as we were talking about when you enlist deploy coins, so an extra coin every time you or a neighbor deploys. You're going to be getting that bonus victory point coin incentive, which is a huge part of making enlists very powerful and more beneficial than buildings in every sense. And when you're getting your mechs as well, that hugely contributes towards that. So deploying and enlisting has good synergy that way. And you also get a good amount of board presence with your mechs, as well as all the other things that mechs enable. So we'll talk about the tier 1, or type 1, excuse me, faction board combinations in terms of their early game plan in future sessions. However, just know right now, usually it's going to be deploying and enlisting. And usually that's the reason, is just there's a lot of incentive for it to be that. So let's take a look at the type 1 boards. This didn't come out quite so clear, but Rustfade Patriotic is currently the only tier 0 faction board combination still enabled in the game. The other 2 are banned. Now we get into tier 1. We talk about Crimea Mechanical. Crimea Mechanical is 1 step away from Crimea Patriotic, and that is broken. I mean, it's really, really strong. Very, very standard type of faction board combination. Rustfade Mechanical is 1 step away from Patriotic Rus, and that obviously is very strong. Agricultural Crimea, quite a strong faction board combination. The agricultural board has a very, very strong bolster plus enlist action, which Crimea really, really takes advantage of. Patriotic Polania. Patriotic is just a broken board, and Polania makes good use of it. Biggest problem with Patriotic Polania is difficulty in early steal, but that is a hurdle that you overcome and become very strong. And then we go down to the slightly worse, in my opinion, Nords Patriotic with 1 neighbor. Nords is very different depending on if you have 1 or 2 neighbors. 2 neighbor Nords, in my opinion, shouldn't be allowed. If there's Albion and Rustfade in the game and somebody else gets Nords, in my opinion, just let that person play another faction, because you basically have no access to a village, especially if Rustfade wants to get in lists. So Patriotic Nords with 1 neighbor, though, is very strong still. A lot of territory control, very, very useful. Patriotic Albion is very solid. I mean, it gets mechs and it gets enlists. The enlists help for the lack of combat cards that Albion has at the start of the game. They start with 0 combat cards. It's a problem. Patriotic fixes that problem. Good upgrades in the early game. It makes good use of them with rally and encounters. Very strong. And then lastly is not really a type 1 faction board combination, I should say. But I put it in tier 1 because it's the strongest type 2 faction board combination. I think I'm going to be talking about Polania Militant just on its own because it is one of the best options, but it is a type 2, which does inherently change the way you play it. A lot of fun though, very unique gameplay. And then a couple other militant ones that are just budget versions of what Polania is doing with it. Then we just see mostly weaker mechanical and patriotic boards. Because mechanical and patriotic are just the best at doing deploy plus enlist. So that's typically why you'll see them down here. Agricultural Polania has some strong options. In terms of popularity, you can really get type like tier 3 pretty reliably with this, and that can be very strong. It's the only one that can consistently do it too, and that contributes to a lot of why it's up here. So these aren't necessarily the best type 1s. The best type 1 is typically just going to be some variant of mechanical or patriotic, usually patriotic. But there are some strong ones that can very much compete in the middle tier here, and sometimes get first place, even though they play a different style. And let's talk about that style. Type 2 gameplay. Usually you're going to be type 2 because usually you're not going to have patriotic or mechanical or be the best patriotic or mechanical option in the game. So that means you're type 2, and type 2 frees us of a lot of responsibilities. We don't have to get 6 stars. So since we're not getting 6 stars, our goal is to typically just get as many points by around round 19 as possible. So how do we do this? So we're going to be rushing 8 workers and finishing our produce actions quickly. So we have 2 options for how we do our produce actions. The first, and these refer to the number of workers on the village. So the first option is we'll have 1 worker plus 1 worker on the village, and we'll produce to 3 workers, and then we'll produce again to 5 workers. And then we'll move one of those workers off of the village, since there's 4 workers on the village and 1 worker elsewhere. So there's 3 workers on the village now, and 2 workers elsewhere. We'll produce to get up to 8. That gives us 4 resources of some kind, and it gets us 8 workers. This is useful with boards that have potentially a bolster plus 1 cost bottom row action once it's upgraded. Something like the engineering board, for instance, has a bolster plus 3 cost building that comes with 3 gold. If you upgrade that, you can upgrade it down to 1 cost. So getting 4 resources, getting 4 wood, for instance, is all the wood you need to get your 4 buildings, and you get your 8 workers. So this is a good setup for something like that, for instance. We could also take 5 produce actions a little bit differently. By starting with 1 on the village and 1 on another territory, we produce up to 3 workers, and we produce again up to 5 workers. Then we move 2, or actually we have to move an entire 3 workers off of the village, since the village currently has 4 workers on it. So we move 3 workers somewhere else, and then we produce 4 resources, plus 1 worker up to 6. Then we produce 4 resources, plus 2 workers up to 8. This costs 1 more popularity, but it gets you a huge number of resources in comparison. This gets you 10 resources total compared to the 4 resources provided here. So If you have more resource requirements in terms of getting your upgrades out, if you have a slow upgrade board, something like the mechanical board, um, getting a mech out, there's some good options for reasons why you want to get this extra resources. It's a lot of extra resources, but it also gets your workers out quickly. So 5 produces compared to 4 produces, and then get the essential components while you're doing this. Get your 1 to 2 upgrades. Um, get your speed or rally mech, regardless of whatever else you're doing. Even if you're going buildings, you're going to need your speed or your rally mech. As long as you're not Togoa, this applies to you. And then you're going to get 1 bottom row star. Typically, that's going to be mechs. Mechs are just, as we discussed, the fastest, the ones that you need the most of regardless. So that's the most efficient star you can get and the fastest star you can get, which enables versatility in other parts of your game. You don't have to go mechs. If you get the engineering board, buildings are totally recommended. I would typically try to stick to buildings or mechs. Militant goes for mechs. That move action is incredible. So you would like a move plus deploy mechs ideally. But move plus build is a strong option for your star. You can also do bolster, especially if it's tied to a 3 coin action. You want to really highly consider this one. But usually you're going to go for a bottom row tied to one of these actions. You can also do trade in certain circumstances, but that's not typically usually the way you go. And then we're just going to do 1 or 2 cost reduction to the area that we're going to get the bottom row star in. Militant, for instance, as we were discussing before, since it's a very good type 2 board, let's talk about it very briefly again. So it has move and deploy with 3 coins attached. The deploy costs 3, and it can be reduced once. Militant gets 1 upgrade because they'd like to get their move upgrade because they have to, and they like to reduce the cost of their mechs down to 2. But they can't reduce it further, so the next upgrade is basically useless. So the first upgrade is insane, though. So you get that 1 upgrade, then you focus on that. Most other boards are going to have something like a bolster tied to something that you can double reduce cost to, and then that's what you're going to go for. Not always, though. And then you're just going to focus on taking a ton of movement actions to maximize your territory. Territory is a lot of points. You're going to be aiming for 10 to 14 territory. And finish your bottom row star. Those are your 2 big priorities. Game ends typically around round 19. It can end faster depending on how players play, so you just be aware of that and try to adjust in accordance to that. Usually taking more movement actions is just always the right choice, though. So you have extra time here. Since you're not getting 6 stars, you're going to have options for what to do with the extra time in between doing all the other things that we were just talking about. Your number 1 priority should be getting Tier 2 popularity. Tier 2 popularity, with our aim of moving frequently and controlling a ton of territory with single workers, with every single faction board, we want to be doing that. So Tier 2 popularity can get us upwards of 17 or 18 more points. Huge priority. 16 power star, if you're going for the bolster plus bottom row action star, very, very frequently the best option. You may need to bolster 1 more time for the 16 power star. Maybe plan for that if you can get the resources to take the bottom row action again for extra coins. That can always be useful, so try to plan out how many times you need to bolster for that 16 power star. And in the rare case where you're doing your trade bottom row action, you can oftentimes be trading for extra resources to do a move and second bottom row action star. Very, very situational. I would say a good trade plus deploy action with star with coins attached to that would be a strong option for that. But there's only like one board with that that I can think of, and you don't always want to be doing it this way. So these are your top 3 priorities. There's some other options. Combat stars, especially if you're bolstering up to 16 power, you can translate the power after you get the power star into combat stars, and that can be the way you get 6 stars in this sort of gameplay, is you're going to be going 16 power into combat stars, as opposed to getting 2 bottom row action stars. And you're going to just be moving and bolstering a lot. And objective stars, and we'll be discussing objectives next time, where objective stars are highly dependent. You might be able to do it, you might not. And that's it. That is the first lesson, Type 1, Type 2 gameplay, and talking about bottom row actions. I hope you guys enjoyed. We'll be back for objectives. I will be uploading the objectives very, very quickly, so expect that soon.